Hello, and welcome to Talk 2 in this journey through the book of Hebrews. We've seen how the author was aware of a church that was in a terrible state, demoralized, discouraged, unbelieving, backsliding, and lost their faith in Jesus and were leaving the church, and he wanted to do something about it. And so we now move into chapter 1 and we find out what he is intending to do to try and set things right in this church. This particular chapter has two major points that it makes. Firstly, that God has a plan of salvation for all people from the very beginning of time. And secondly, that Jesus is the final and ultimate revelation of this plan, superior to anything and everything that has gone before. There are other subpoints in it which we shall pick up as we move along, but really it's these two on which he focuses. So let's just have a look at them. First of all, God's plan of salvation introduced by himself from the beginning, because we find if we look in Genesis, the first 3 or 4 chapters, many times God speaks. He speaks in creation in chapter 1. He speaks to Adam and Eve in the garden. And he speaks in what we would call a sort of friendly way, the sort of way that we would talk to people if we were being in a relationship with them. And he speaks to give them instructions and to give them guidance. But it's not just that. As we move on through the book of Genesis, we go into chapter 6, we find that he speaks to Noah. Not only does he talk in a friendly way, he also gives him instructions. An ark, build it, and this is the dimensions of it. Please do it. So Noah does, and he fulfills the request of God to take his family into the ark. They sail, they come out when the flood subsides, and God then talks to Noah once more. And he chats to him and offers a covenant agreement with Noah. The covenant agreement that God will never again destroy the total earth by flood. And not only does he talk about it, he will give a symbol that it will not happen again. So we get the rainbow. And whatever Pride and other organisations think of the rainbow, we know exactly what it's for. And every time we see it, we should be thankful to God for this covenant that he made with Noah. But we can carry on still further, and we find that in chapter 12, God speaks with Abraham. And we go on. I'm not going all through, the Old Testament with God speaking. You can find those for yourself, but it's examples. God is speaking and introducing his plan of salvation for all people, not just the Jews, which of course didn't exist at that time, but not just the chosen ones. It was for all people. And we come on to the how else he does it. Not only does he does it speaking himself, but he introduces it through prophets. We're told the prophets speak many times and in a variety of ways. It's not a quick fix at all. The variety of ways, if we think about speaking for a moment, there's more than just words to speak. You can speak through a picture, through a photograph, through dance, through drama. All sorts of things can speak to us. They can settle in our minds, settle in our hearts, and change our ways. And this is what God's doing. He's speaking in a variety of ways, many times, dealing with the sin of the people and trying to lead them into this salvation that he has promised them. So let's look at an example or two of the prophets. Firstly, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 2. And that says to Ezekiel, "The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, and to say to them what he's told to say. And Ezekiel has to go out and preach this message, which is, well, in our terms, frightening. It is a hard and a harsh method, but it's telling the people exactly what they are, that they are rebellious, that they're stubborn, and that they've turned away from God. And Ezekiel is trying to bring them back. But Ezekiel speaks not only through words, he speaks through actions on the direction, of course, of God. So in one instance, we find that Ezekiel is told, your wife is going to die, but that's going to be used by me as an example. Ezekiel is wrapped up for a year as an example, as an illustration of what God is trying to say. And there are other things. And the book of Ezekiel is well worth reading and looking for these ways in which God speaks to the people and, of course, to us. We'll go to Isaiah 6, verse 8. God speaks and says, who shall I send? Who will go for us to take the message? And Isaiah replies, here am I, send me. To which God immediately responds, go and tell this the people. It's the same message that Ezekiel is preaching. Isaiah and Ezekiel were more or less at the same time preaching the same message to the group of people who were going to be ultimately, and in some instances in the book, were taken into captivity by the Babylonians. So it's a similar sort of thing. And Isaiah suffers in the same way that Ezekiel did. But the smaller prophets equally have their problems. Habakkuk 1 verse 1 tells us the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received to tell the people. Hosea is even worse. Hosea in chapter 1 verse 2 is told to go and marry a prostitute. And he goes and marries her. He's told to have children by her, which he does. And then God uses this as an illustration of her unfaithfulness to Hosea as she carries on her day job, if you like. But she is unfaithful to him in the same way that Israel is unfaithful to God. And it's not a happy situation for either Hosea or for the nation. This is the job Hosea's got and a life he has to live. In 1 Samuel 16, Samuel is told, fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. What for? To anoint a new king. So Jesse gets his sons, and Samuel is amazed that he's anointing the smallest and the youngest of these sons, David. At the same time, Saul is still king of Israel. And if he knew what Samuel was doing, then he would be none too pleased. The job of the prophet was quite difficult and sometimes quite frightening. If we turn to the last book of the Old Testament, to the book of Malachi, we find things are no different. The book begins with an oracle, the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. And of course, as we noticed when we were looking at the Sermon on the Mount, that after the book of Malachi, there was the 500 years of silence when God didn't speak in any way to the country, and they wondered what had happened. They were left to flounder in their own way. But speaking through prophets and speaking himself weren't the only two ways. God spoke through angels. And again, if we turn back to Genesis and to Abraham, we find that a combination of God and angels was speaking to Abraham as he is told, among other things, that his wife would have a child when she was in old age. When we move into the book of Zechariah, we find that Zechariah is primarily just having a conversation with an angel and having to do what the angel has got planned for him. We can go into the New Testament and we find that Mary Magdalene in Matthew 28 is out in the garden looking for Jesus, and an angel appears to her to tell her he is risen. Or move out of the Gospels into the book of Acts, Acts chapter 12, verse 18. Peter is locked in prison, and suddenly an angel appears and tells him to get his sandals on and make haste and sort himself out and get ready to walk out of this prison as the gates are open for him. So ways and means, not just words, but actions and living the faith is the way forward here. And this is what this author is trying to tell this particular church, that this God is all powerful. But at the end of it all, he comes to the key point that God sent his son to earth, we're told in chapter 1, verse 3 of Hebrews, to provide a purification for sins. So now we find that this author is bringing the focus onto Jesus, where it will stay for the more or less the rest of the book, one way or another. Jesus is the final and ultimate revelation of this plan of God's for our salvation. Titus chapter 2 verse 11 tells us, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people." God has dealt with sin. There is then the gift of eternal life, John 3:16. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Back into the book of Hebrews and to verse 3 again, we find that the Son is the radiance of God's glory. And also in the same verse is the exact representation of the Father. The Father and the Son are one. And this author is trying to hammer it in to these people in the Hebrew church. The writer goes on to show how Jesus is superior to the angels. And it's interesting that he should do this, because at the time the Jews were believing that angels were in fact operating to a degree outside the will of God, that they were the power on their own. Not true. And we find, if we start looking from verse 5 downwards, the author tells you that Jesus, you are my son. Jesus is the Son of God. I will be his Father. Verse 6, let angels worship him. So the angels are going to have to worship the Son. That's not equality. That's not being superior to the Son. When you worship somebody, you are admitting your inferiority to them. Verse 7 tells us it shows the position of the angels as servants. And verses 8 and 9, the Son's throne shall last forever. And we come ultimately to verse 10. In the beginning, Lord, this is God talking to Jesus, you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain, and they will wear out like a garment. You will roll them up like a robe. God and Jesus are planning this great salvation of all people. And that's what we're going to look at, and that's what the book of Hebrews looks at later on, how this operates. And this is just the introduction to it. Before I go, just let me to suggest to you that it might be worthwhile having a commentary on this book that you can look at for yourself. I can think of three that I found useful. One is William Barclay's book, Hebrews. There's Tom Wright's book, Hebrews for Everyone. Or there's The Bible Speaks Today by Raymond Brown, on just called Hebrews. They're all available from Eden Books. Also, if you want any further information, please contact me on email. You can get my email address from ChurchSuite if you've got access to that. Or you can go onto the St. John's website and go to the office, and the office contact will give you my email, and you can ask for any of the references, the book titles, anything you want, and we'll move on from there. But thank you very much for listening.